Mozart's musical genius continues to captivate and inspire generations. But amidst his extraordinary legacy, debates persist about his heritage. One particular discussion revolves around the possibility of Mozart having Moorish ancestry. What are the experts' opinions on this matter? Let's go ahead and read some of the reports that have been written on this particular subject of Mozart's heritage. Now, keep in mind that all the evidence I'm presenting to you here today are not of my making, but rather of so-called experts, historians, scholars, and reporters. I bet most of you think that Mozart's identity has already been cemented in stone as it pertains to what he really looks like, but that's not the case, as I'm going to be reading from many reports today. If you don't agree with the things I'm going to read, then you must ask yourself if you really believe in these so-called experts. Okay, let's start reading from these reports. Mozart was born on January 27, 1756 in Salzburg, Austria. He was baptized on the day of his birth with the name Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus. Name changing among prominent historical figures is a common practice done by historians to hide the real identity of these figures, and many times their identity are given to someone else along their attributes and contributions, as I believe is the case with Mozart. This Thomson-Hewitt report states that although Mozart was born in Austria, there is evidence that he had Moorish ancestry. This is supported by his physical appearance, which was described as dark and swarthy. Furthermore, his family name Mozart is derived from the German word Moor, which means black. There's also evidence that Mozart was exposed to Moorish culture during his travels. In 1769, he visited the city of Bologna, which was then under papal rule. While there, he met a group of Moorish musicians who were performing at the local court. This experience may have influenced his later composition, The Marriage of Figaro, which includes a number of Moorish musical elements. Whether or not Mozart was actually of Moorish descent, there is no doubt that he was influenced by Moorish culture. This is evident in his music, which is characterized by its beauty, technical mastery, and emotional power. There are a few possible explanations for why Mozart is called black, the same report then adds. One theory is that it was a nickname given to him by his friends or colleagues, in reference to his dark features or perhaps his moodiness. Another possibility is that the name was given to him posthumously by people who felt that his music was dark or melancholic. It's also possible that the name was simply a play on word, with Mozart being famous composer and black being a synonym for bad or evil. Whether the case may be, the nickname has stuck on Mozart is now known as the Black Composer. From a previous report, this same writer adds that there are also several descriptions of Mozart that suggest he may have had dark skin. Mozart's contemporary, the German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, describes him as the blackamoor's delight. Another writer, Henry Gretry, describes Mozart as the little Negro. And Mozart's biographer, Hermann Ebert, wrote that Mozart had somewhat of a Negroid appearance. While the evidence is far from conclusive, it is possible that Mozart was black. And just like Beethoven, they are not denying that Mozart could be black. They are just saying that there's no evidence to back it up, as if the people that lived during his lifetime calling him a blackamoor and a Negro is not evidence enough. Let's read some other reports. The two main labels that have been used to describe the nationality of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart are Austrian and German. However, in Mozart's own life, those terms were used differently from the way they are used today, because the modern nations of Austria and Germany did not yet exist, as they were part of the Holy Roman Empire. Any decisions to label Mozart as Austrian or German or neither involves political boundaries, history, language, culture, and Mozart's own views. Editors of modern encyclopedias and other reference sources differ on how they assign a nationality to Mozart, if any, in light of conflicting criteria. In this report, it says that the appearance and character of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart are subject of multiple investigations at the present. The fact that it has not been possible to exhume Mozart's remains due to the exact location of the community grave in which he was buried is unknown, nor are mask or mortuary casts preserved, lends a degree of uncertainty to the composer's physical appearance. So, if these co-experts claim to have no idea what Mozart actually looked like, where are all these portraits that we have of the famous composer coming from? Well, they are all subject of artistic interpretation. And this is one of the biggest problems with modern historians. They are quick to rewrite history as long as it fits a certain narrative and their own personal beliefs, even if those beliefs don't align with other historians' beliefs and directly contradicts other evidence. They will even fabricate evidence to help them push their narrative, as I show in my previous video of the fabricated DNA evidence of Beethoven. Now, when a crime is committed and there are multiple witnesses, they are not interrogated together for a reason. They are interrogated separately to see if their stories align. If their stories don't align, then either someone or everyone is telling a lie. But this happens in history all the time, where stories don't align. Yet, the ones that are called liars are the ones pointing out those inconsistencies, which is the case here, contradicting previous report about Mozart's appearance. This report states that there are 14 images created in Mozart's lifetime that are known to exist, sometimes reproduced in different mediums like oil paintings, engravings, or medallions. The Mausoleum holds example of 9 of them and has borrowed 3 others for a show. The remaining lifetime portraits were not available, said the director of the Foundation's museum and of Mozart's birthplace. The following reports directly contradict this report. It says that in the impossible search to know exactly what the face of musical genius looked like, again, I repeat, in the impossible search to know what exactly the face of the musical genius looked like, researchers in Salzburg, Austria have made progress, they say. Their subject was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a local boy. One portrait thought to be of Mozart turned out to be someone else. Again, one portrait long thought to be of Mozart turned out to be someone else. Another suspect image was confirmed to be of him, and a third portrait deemed incomplete was actually found to consist of a finished piece crafted onto a larger canvas. That portrait, it's one of the most famous portraits, they say, and the one that Mozart's wife Constance considered the most true to life, and has long been considered unfinished. It is by Joseph Lang, Mozart's brother-in-law, and shows him in profile looking down with his face emerging from a dark background, with a triangle torso surrounded by scratched white space. The painting, dating from 1789, without a doubt looks unfinished, like a classical symphony of 2 movements. X-ray and infrared analysis performed at the Dornell Institute in Munich and Art Research Institute last December showed that a small completed painting of Mozart's head and shoulder had been trimmed and mounted at some point on a larger canvas, with paint added around the edges to smooth out the surface. The enlargement was unfinished, not the original. That means that someone supposedly took an original finished portrait of Mozart and tried to enlarge it by overpainting it. But anyone that collects anything knows that tampering with an original piece of a collector's item actually lessens the value. So what was the real motive? And was this really a finished portrait of Mozart? And then in 1924, a British art dealer sold the Mausoleum a portrait of a boy in a long brown jacket holding a bird's nest and standing in front of a round table with an open book on it. When the foundation bought the painting, W.A. Mozart 1764 was inscribed on a page of the book. An engraving of the portrait commissioned by the art dealer and now in Vienna Museum included the name. The initials stand for Wolfgang Amadeus. But doubt lingered about the authenticity of the identification, Ms. Remsauer said, in part because Mozart rarely used Amadeus in his lifetime. Gottlieb, the German form, was his preferred usage. We always wrote Mozart with a little question mark, Ms. Remsauer said. When curators examined the painting recently, the name was missing from the book page. A search of the Mausoleum archives found a 1928 restoration report that said all overpainting had been removed, including the W.A. Mozart inscription. Now we're sure that one of the former owners had made these overpaintings and had published this engraving in 1906 to sell his portrait, Ms. Ramsauer said. We were always wondering why Mozart should be painted with a bird's nest in his hand. So now we have evidence showing that one of these portraits that's believed to be of Mozart was tampered with, and another sold to the Mozart Museum does not actually depict Mozart, but someone else. Again, why would a museum buy anything before making sure of its authenticity? With the art world is that it's not the most ethical industry. It is an industry controlled by the elites. And just like archaeology, they do not want outside experts or real science interfering in their field. They get to pick who the so-called experts are and what information gets released and the narrative that is told. And if anyone says anything that goes against their narrative, they will destroy their character and their careers immediately. But even with that being the case, there are still real scientific analysis done on both of these fields, and it's up to us to interpret the information released and determine if it is done without intentional bias. Such is the case of this next report from 2013 found in a website called Neuroscience of Music, where they tried to determine the authenticity of a newly discovered portrait of young Mozart, believed to be the earliest portrayal of the composer from 1762, using scientific analysis. The report says that scientific identification of faces in oil paintings is still a young discipline. Until a few years ago, one could even hear the opinions that the whole discipline was a false beginning. In art, we will be dealing with artifacts, not with images that mirror reality, such as photography, the art world argued. This view, however, is based on a serious category error. From the age of the Renaissance until the beginning of the age of photography, portrait painters worked under conditions of a strictly limited freedom. They were commissioned to produce a facial image that would generally be recognized as faithfully by anybody who had seen the depicted person. Only in a few exceptional cases could the facial traits be arbitrarily altered. As a rule, they had to be reality bound. So the art world is saying that these are just paintings and they don't have to resemble the person being portrayed. And science is saying, that's not how this whole thing works. The report is titled The Earliest Portrait of W.A. Mozart, a biometrical analysis of the newly discovered Frühstoffer Mozart from 1762. And it says that the painting is in oil on canvas 49 by 37 centimeters, apparently still with its first frame, 62 by 50 centimeters. The portrait was sold in 2010 from a private home around 70 kilometers from Salzburg, Austria, where it had been from 1922. Before that year, the portrait was owned by the Austrian brewer family Frühstoffers. The earlier provenance is not known. It is known, however, that in 1850 Rosina Frühstoffer and her husband Sigmund Hoffmann became the owners of the pub Burgerbrau in the Linsengasse in Salzburg. This traditional Salzburg pub, which is documented from 1413, was in the neighborhood of W.A. Mozart's home. In 1777, W.A. Mozart was invited to the wedding of the brewer of the Burgerbrau. And oftentimes, these are the stories that they come up with to prove the authenticity of some of these portraits, such as this one, which to me sounds like it's all made up. I will post the link of the report if you guys want to read it, but for the purpose of this video, I'm only going to concentrate on a particular portrait, and it's called the Lorenzoni Portrait of Mozart. And to prove the authenticity of the newly discovered portrait of Mozart, three portraits of Mozart were used for comparison. The Mozart portrait that would be historically closest one is the so-called Lorenzoni Mozart. It was commissioned by the father Leopold Mozart and is today attributed to the year 1763 and the painter Pietro Antonio Lorenzoni. However, it had to be excluded as a reference portrait for the present study due to grave painting errors. In 2006, a newly discovered boy portrait was found to be a partly altered copy of the Lorenzoni Mozart, a portrait we touched on earlier. At that time, an investigation of the case had revealed the following painting errors in the Lorenzoni Mozart. A close inspection of the Lorenzoni Mozart reveals that the painter made several technical mistakes that a skillful portrait painter would not make. First, the general impression is that they were dealing with a face that is adult-like. In particular, the proportions of the forehead and the chin are typical for adults, but untypical for a child aged 7. If the parts are cut off, the face suddenly becomes childlike. My interpretation of that information is that the Lorenzoni portrait was created using the real adult portrait of Mozart as a reference, but tried to make him look 7 years old, as I will show you later on. Another serious construction error lies in the treatment of the perspective. The frontal plane of the head looks pressed in at its right side, because the right side plane of the head is given too much space on the canvas. The horizontal distance between the right eye and the right ear is much too long. Besides the two global errors, there are 5 major errors in face details. Again, if it was Mozart's father the one to commission this portrait, he would have found the best painter and someone he was familiar with, and not someone that would commit all these errors. Another error is that the right side of his nose is considerably higher than the left side. Such asymmetry never occurs in a healthy nose, and it does not occur in other Mozart portraits. Translation: The left side of the nose does not match the right side of the nose, as the right nostril is higher than the left nostril. And this was done on purpose because if you look at the right nostril and duplicate that on the left nostril, you will see that Mozart had a broad, wide nose as described in his original biography. But they made the right side of the nose higher to try and hide this fact and to give him a thinner nose. And as the report says, this is the only Mozart portrait to display these anomalies. The next one says that the lower part of the nose is bent towards the right. Also, this asymmetry never occurs in a healthy nose, and it does not occur in any other portraits of Mozart. Again, a lot of work was put in to try and conceal Mozart's true Moorish identity, which is pretty obvious in his nose. This is why subsequent portraits of Mozart did not use the original portrait as a reference, and instead rely on artistic interpretation. Again, more on the nose. The shadow on the left side of the nose is wrong in four respects. A is too dark. B, too sharp at its edges. C, too high up along the nose. And D, straight line cuts across the nose tip instead of circling around it. The other error they found is that the left eye is focused on the observer, but the right eye is slightly turned lateral. This condition does not occur in other Mozart portraits. That's even more proof that the painter did not have a live subject to base his portrait on. And the last error they found is that the lower part of the right ear is highly unnatural and fully incompatible with other Mozart portraits. If you look at the right earlobe and follow what would be its natural pattern to complete the ear, it will give the 7-year-old Mozart a giant ear. Now, these are all scientific analyses that have determined that the portrait of Mozart that is considered to be the most faithful interpretation of his likeness have grave errors. There are a few possible explanations for this. One, that the painter was not a very skilled painter, which is highly unlikely given the status of the Mozart family. Two, that the portrait was tampered with just like the other Mozart portraits that we have discussed on this video. Or three, which is what I think happened and what I explained earlier. A version of an adult portrait of Mozart was used as reference to make a young 7-year-old white version of the composer, and this is why he has adult features, while also altering the features to make him not look like a Moor, and that is apparent in all the work that was putting into altering his nose, while also ignoring other laws that govern the art, such as shadows and symmetry, because they never thought that science and technology would catch up to them. This report states that if you take a closer look, you will note a few puzzling aspects of Mozart's appearance. On one hand, we have how he is depicted on the Mozart Cougar. Here, there's something definitely going on with his nose. Inadvertently or not, they have given Mozart a bit of a nose job, making him prettier and younger. On the other hand, we have his portraits. In fact, paintings of his musical genius are hanging all over the walls at his birthplace, and somehow there is no consistency to the eye color. The fact is that in the 18th century, artists liked to paint people with blue eyes, which was deemed more beautiful back then. But in reality, Mozart had dark brown eyes, and sadly, the bottom line is Mozart would have never been described as a handsome man. Now, besides archaeology, can you imagine any other industry that have this much flip-flops and still be considered experts? So what did the real Mozart look like? This here is the real Mozart. Now I know what you're thinking. Haha, that's not Mozart. That's Olaudia Equiano. And you're in fact be mistaken. So-called historians try to give him the identity of Olaudio Equiano or Gustavo Vasa as the so-called experts say. I mean, as long as he is black, nobody will notice the difference between the two. They probably thought. Just because they're both black and have similar hairlines doesn't mean they're both the same person. First, he was Olaudio Equiano or Gustavo Vasa, as they say. And when that didn't work, he was a young Ignacio Sancho, a composer. Because in fact, that's what he really is. But unfortunately for them, who can't tell the difference between two black people, him and Ignacio Sancho look nothing alike. So notice how they went from claiming he was a writer to now a young composer, which is now more in line with who he really is. And to further prove my point, we have this report from 2019 where it's asking who is the sitter in a portrait of an African as it was previously known and it was attributed to Alan Ramsey. From 1960s onward, the sitter was thought to be abolitionist and writer Olaudia Equiano. Since 2006, he has been identified as the writer, composer, and actor Ignacio Sancho. although there has been remaining doubts about whether Sancho is the subject, as reflected in the former title on Art UK, Portrait of an African, possibly Ignacio Sancho. The Royal Albert Memorial Museum has no fixed position on the correct title of the work, but is open to new research and attributions if there is substantial evidence. And then it was updated again in 2023. This painting was renamed Portrait of a Man in a Red Suit. The date was readjusted from 1757 to 1760 to 1740, 1780, and the attribution to Alan Ramsey replaced by unknown artist. At this point, they'll throw any name at this painting to see what sticks. Now, remember that portrait of young Mozart that scientific analysis determined had too many inconsistencies and errors to be considered for analysis of other Mozart paintings? Well, let's take a look at that painting side by side with the real Mozart. Now, look past the skin color and let's examine the features that these two portraits have in common, such as the big eyes with identical shape, the bags under their eyes, and the right cheek looks as if they're swollen on both portraits. Identical smiles, and look at the nose. You definitely see why they tried to give young Mozart a smaller left nostril, just like in the older version of the portrait. The right nostril of young Mozart flares out just like the older version as well. They tried to give him a smaller bottom lip, and that's why his chin is too long for a boy, as determined by the scientific analysis that was done of the portrait. Now take a look at what happens when you hyperimpose one image on top of the other. All the facial features align perfectly with one another, such as the pupils, the eyes, the eyebrows, the overall shape of the eyes, the nose, the lips and chin, and the overall outline of the face, as if they traced one image from the other and just made them look younger and white, of course. Now think about it. Should the features of a 7-year-old white child be identical to the features of a much older black male, especially if in no way, shape, or form they have anything to do with one another? Now let's compare the portrait of the real Mozart to the most recognized face of the whitewashed version of the composer. Take a quick glance, and you can see this portrait is very delicate and very detailed. The background effect is very consistent all around the portrait. The facial features are lifelike. It's almost like a picture. You can walk down the street and find many black guys that look like this man. The hair, the eyes, the nose, and the lips are all lifelike. The crackling on the paint all around the portrait is very consistent in all areas, sign that this portrait has not been tampered with. The paint of the garment also appears beautifully painted and with much attention paid to details. For a person who was supposedly a nobody, they sure did a good job on this portrait. In comparison, the whitewashed version appears very sloppy. The background effects are not consistent all around the portrait. You can see some areas in front of the left side of his face that is fading and it's brighter than the rest of the painting, and you will see why that is in a moment. Also, the facial features are not lifelike and don't appear to portray a real person because nobody looks like that. Now look at the white paint from the neck area. Looks very rough in compared to other parts of the portrait. Also, look at the scarf. You can definitely see the paint doesn't look very well blended in with the other areas, a sign that this was an overpainting job. You can also see sloppy overpainting in the shoulder area and some yellowing with what looks to be like dirt spots in front of the jacket. How is it possible that this portrait does not match the quality of the portrait of a black man of the same era? Now let's hyperimpose one image on top of the other, and let's see any similarities that these two portraits share. Now please concentrate on the right side of the face, since the left side of the face has been altered. That further proves that it's very difficult for two portraits to align perfectly with one another with their physical features when they have nothing to do with each other. Now I want you to pay attention to the eyes again, as they have similar shapes. The sideburns are also identical on both portraits, and the hairline leading to the sideburn is also identical. The right side of the mouth also, even though on the whitewash version they tried to make the lips smaller, but ended up with a weird looking face. The same thing with the nose, identical placement, except they made the nose on the whitewash version of the portrait smaller, but ended up with a deformed looking nose. Now, do you see that part of the whitewash portrait that's brighter than the rest? The reason is because if you pay close attention, they painted over the real Mozart's part that they wanted to cover. You can even see the exact outline of the real Mozart's hair in the part of the whitewash portrait that's fading away. My last piece of evidence for this being the real Mozart is the fact that Mozart had either one or both deformed ears. According to so-called historians, it was his left ear that had the deformity, a condition known today as Mozart's ear. According to so-called historians, these ears were drawn by Mozart himself to show his deformity, with the ear on the left being Mozart's. And this report from 1986 from the British Medical Journal says that it is a peculiar irony of fate that the man whose inner ear has, so to speak, the highest human development has a retarded and malformed outer ear. Again, a retarded and malformed outer ear, with the quote being made in 1898 by a person named Gilbert. This same report analyzes the ear drawings attributed to Mozart's ear and make the following racist observation. A strange watercolor which shows two ears. One is the ear of the author of Don Juan, meaning Mozart, and the other ear of a common mortal. The edge of the ear, instead of being rounded as it is normally, is an interrupted curve, abruptly folded at the obtuse angle. The pinna, while usually takes the form of a shell, presents a flat surface and is hardly shaped. The fleshy part shows the same abnormalities as the cartilage, and the lower lobe has a complete defect. Together with that, the entire ear is of unusual size, and instead of being elongated as has generally evolved in superior races, for example in Caucasians, is distinguished by greater width, normally attributed to less civilized races. So they're just basically saying that white people couldn't basically have that deformity since they are their superior race. Now look at any portrait of the whitewashed version of Mozart, and you will see that he appears to have been portrayed with normal ears on both sides. But you know who has a deformed ear? This guy. I mean, for a guy who's supposed to be just some random African in a red jacket, they sure do love him. Now take a look at this album cover and tell me that these people don't know the truth. Out of all the portraits, images, and pictures they could have picked for an album cover, that they went with this one just because? I don't think so. Now, I know a lot of people, even when confronted with factual evidence, will still come up with the arguments that he can't be black because we have portraits of his parents and kids and they are portrayed as white, even though I proved that whitewashing is a thing. But to help put things into perspective, here's a picture of Mozart's whitewashed son, Franz Xaver. If you take a real close look to his right, you will see a human-shaped shadow that should not be there. I highlighted it so you can see it better. Not even a novice painter would dare put a shadow there, unless they were trying to cover something. Now, this is a picture of a supposed slave that supposedly belonged to Madame Dewberry, even though he is wearing the finest silk. Now look at the shadow again when you hyperimpose one portrait on top of the other, and tell me that that is a coincidence, when in fact this is evidence that this portrait has been whitewashed, making Zemmour, as he was called, the most likely real Franz Xaver. Now look at Mozart's other whitewashed son, and you can see that half of his face on this portrait is crackling, unlike the rest of the portrait, suggesting that it has been tampered with, or else the crackling on the paint will be consistent all over. His sister was also whitewashed, but you can't deny that hair. So to remedy that, they just gave her a makeover and made her look like a completely different person that looks like the young whitewashed version of young Mozart. I'm still working on uncovering the real identities of his other son and his wife to give you a complete picture of the real Mozart family, but I believe I'm very close.